When Master went back to India, Paramhansa Yogananda, when he went back to India in 1935, he came to America in 1920, he went back to India once for about a year and a half, and then returned to America and lived here until 1952 when he died. And during that year that he was in India, he visited family and old friends, and he also went to visit a particular saint that he knew about, a man named Sri Rama Yogi at that time, Yogi Ramya also, he was known as. He was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, and Master said that he was a fully liberated soul, this yogi. And there's a picture of Master with him, walking with him. He's a very unassuming yogi. And Master said the bliss of being with someone really of equal consciousness, he said, was so extraordinary that if he had spent another 30 minutes in his company, he said, he would never have been able to bring himself to leave India and to come back to the materialistic West. So when Swami Kriyananda was living in India from 1958 to 1962, he went to find this yogi because he was still living, and naturally, with a recommendation like that from his guru, he really wanted to see him. So he found him living in some isolated village, I don't know where it was, living very humbly, very much by himself, and Swami went and spent 4 days with him in his little hut there. Swami doesn't usually tell the story, but the villagers were so entranced with this American yogi, and Swami himself was a very bright light. He said they used to line up outside the hut before dawn, waiting for him to come out so they could have his darshan. But what was the interesting point that I wanted to talk about here was how humbly and obscurely this yogi lived. People hadn't read Autobiography of a Yogi, and I don't think Yogi Ramya was even necessarily mentioned in there. I can't remember if it's in there or not. But in any case, he just lived in a very humble way among the villagers. They had no idea of his spiritual stature. He had no position at all in the world. He was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, who was very well known, but he wasn't famous in his ashram, or he was just a complete non-entity from the point of view of the world. And Swami even said to him, what you just live here and these villagers pay you no regard. He said, no, I talk to them about the crops and the weather and the food, he said, because that's all they're interested in. They're not interested in anything else. And from the yogi's point of view, he was nobody bothered him because nobody knew what he had to offer, nobody wanted what he had to offer. So he just was able to have his life. And then Swamiji actually raised another question, which is, don't you think you ought to be doing something more for the world? Which was in essence that. And the yogi said, God has done what he has wanted to do through this instrument. Now, of course, radiating divine light is a tremendous service because it creates a pulse. I'll speak about that in a moment, that helps uplift people. It's a very mysterious interplay of light and dark in this world, and thank God not everything is done by those who appear to have power. And the power that they appear to have is not as much power as they appear to have, because there's something completely other going on. But in the light of what our reading is today, about Adam and Eve, which I don't know how much I'm going to take on of Adam and Eve today, but the point of the reading and the point of the spiritual life is summarized exactly in these lines from the Bhagavad Gita. What is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. And what is night to the worldly man looks like day to the yogi. I mean, that's a very famous verse that many of us learned quite early on. But a large part of us thinks that there's kind of a twilight zone that we can live in where we can bring the two of them together. And that somehow or another, the extreme nature of that is not really going to be true. And the story of Adam and Eve, because it gets so based around the concept of sexuality, is one of those stories where we just really want it to be different. And the enormous philosophical and spiritual movements that are all based on, well, we want it to be different. It's not really such a black and white reality. And it's very complicated because it isn't such a black and white reality in this sense, which is nothing is imposed upon us, and nothing is gained spiritually by imposing upon ourselves some kind of image of what we're supposed to be spiritually. When Swami Kriyananda would be asked, as he was from time to time by someone in a challenging way, why do I need a guru? Do I need a guru? And Swami's answer was often, not if you don't think so. Do I need to give up drinking? Well, not if you don't think so. Do I need to become celibate? No, not if you don't think so. Because it has to be based, every aspect of our spiritual life has to be based not on somebody else's dogma, not on somebody else's assertion that this is going to be the way it's going to work out for you. It only ever works if our spiritual life is based on what we ourselves actually perceive as the source of our happiness, and what we ourselves find as a way of life that in and of itself brings us what we want. When I left to go to Ananda, when I say left, which is resigned from the meaningless job I had and left the apartment that I was living in and moved out into a tent. I'd never been camping or anything, and just left everything and went to live in this tent up at the meditation retreat at Ananda Village, which was just barely anything. There was no context whatsoever for what I did. There was no sense of just gathering myself up for this heroic sacrifice, that I would be. It was, I ran as eagerly and as quickly as I could possibly go to get to a place that to me looked like everything that I wanted, rather than, oh dear, I have to because this hard, evil God, this is what he demands of me. There's a story about Teresa of Avila, of course, who grew to be a great saint. When she was a young child, she was very devoted to the spiritual life, and she was eager to have an eternity with God. In the Catholic theology, there was no reincarnation. It was very simple. If you made it through, then you got to go to heaven. And her own inner experience far transcended that, but that was what she was working with when she was a child. And she calculated it and saw that the quickest and most efficient way to have an eternity with God was to be martyred. So the way to be martyred then, in her time, was to go out and try to convert the Moors and have the Moors just cut off your head. So she persuaded her brother. She was about 7 and her brother was 8. And the two of them set out to find the Moors, which were somewhere on the edge of Spain where she lived, and just have their heads chopped off. And she was just going to cut through the whole system. There was a unique way to run away from home as a child. And eventually, of course, her father found her and her brother walking down the street with their little valises going out, trying to be martyred. And on one hand, it was actually a pretty clever thing to do. Just a little bit of trouble, a little bit of pain, and then an eternity of bliss. Why not? Just skip the whole middle part. But of course, that was because she looked at the world around her. And she was a very privileged child of a very privileged family, an extremely charismatic and beautiful young woman who had had the potential to have everything that a person wanted in the world. It was all just at her feet. She could have had all of it. But when she looked at it, it didn't look the same to her anymore. And this is where the day and the night begin to shift. And she undertook a life of great discipline and dedication, and there were days and nights of determined willpower and effort. It is not necessarily so simple even when your point of view is clear, but she looked at the life that was right in front of her, and it didn't look the same to her. And so then when someone says to her, do you need to do this? Do you need to do that? No. This is not what I want anymore. And our project on the spiritual path, it's actually perfectly described in the quality of the week today, which was truthfulness, where it was said, truthfulness is looking at ourselves without self-justification, without excuses, but to actually have the capacity, and the words are perfect, to understand our true motives. What are we really trying to do, and who are we really? And the thing about it, which is so depressing when you finally really get this, is that God and Guru know us better than we know ourselves. And just like little children, I remember when I was 7 years old and I went to sleepaway camp. And I was a very young child there. I was one of the youngest in the camp. And one of the things we did, some of you have heard me tell this, we had to weave these pot holders on this little stretchy loom. Whatever it was a little too much for my 7-year-old fingers. And so I never ended up with any pot holders. So when Parents' Day came, and my parents came to see me, everybody had pot holders hanging on these little nails on their bunks, and I didn't have any. So I took 2 of them from the girl below me, and I hung them on mine. Let's see, it must have been reversed. I was below, and she was above, so I took them like this. Of course, she noticed, and there was a big kerfuffle about it. And I can still remember saying very strongly, they fell. And I also remember very sweetly that, although my parents were quite strict about telling the truth, I remember that they understood. They understood what was happening, and I don't remember being scolded. I only remember being comforted. But still, I think about that a lot of times in my life. When something has happened where either my expectations were disappointed, my own expectations of myself were disappointed, and I think of just that little child mind. They fell. I wasn't really at fault. I didn't really do it. No. It wasn't really that my whole concept of life is wrong. It isn't really that God is trying to guide me to a deeper, more lasting kind of happiness. No, that's not what's happening. I can find that twilight zone where I get to be a devotee and I get to also ignore the tree that tells me about good and evil. This is what was planted in the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden story is a horrible story. These poor saps, this is what Swami writes in The Path. These poor saps just have a bite of this fruit and then they're exiled forever. What is going on here? What kind of a God is this? Who would want to have anything to do with this? One bite of an apple and zip, that's the end of it. But what's really being told to us is, where does our happiness come from? Sexuality gets to be the big story. But Swami spoke of it once just so simply. He said, once we take a physical body, we are compelled by many physical imperatives. We believe we need to eat, to protect ourselves from the cold. We can't go on indefinitely without sleeping. Sexuality is a physical imperative. Once we have identified ourselves with our body and have begun to experience life through this physical means, then a whole host of false identities begin to compel us. And with those false identities comes a very specific sense of, if I don't have this, I suffer. And so we set up an entire world. I mean, this wonderful Palo Alto world that we live in, I've described to my friends. It's getting a little out of hand now, but I've lived here for some decades, and it's intelligent, it's educated, it's refined, it's cultured. It generally speaking has good taste. It's interesting. I mean, it's lively. It's 1,000-word effort to see if the physical plane can actually, truly make us lastingly happy. And it's very good karma to be in an environment like this. It's good karma to be born into a wealthy family, because then you get to try it all out faster. One of my friends whose mother died when she was relatively young, and she assumed she didn't actually become the head of the household, but her father, not inappropriately, gave her a lot of responsibility, so she had his credit cards, and she could just live as an adult person, as a teenager. She didn't misuse it, and she said it was just wonderful, because by the time she was 19, she was done. Some people have to spend their whole lives doing it. This last desperate effort to see if I can line it up and it'll work. And then we try that, and we try it over and over. Master said so sweetly that reincarnation is, we reincarnate not because it fails miserably to fulfill us, but because it almost works. And that's so much more aggravating. It almost worked. It almost worked. If I could just tweak it just this little bit. So we tweak it just that little bit, and it didn't quite work, but then we're going to tweak it this little bit. And the wonderful thing about God is we have all eternity, and we can just keep trying, and we can just keep trying, and there's nothing wrong with it. We're compelled. Those physical imperatives, sexuality being one of them, we're pushed out into relationship with the world around us, because whether we admit it or not, there's lots we want, and there's lots we don't yet know. So we have our marriages and our children and our families, and all of these things are God-sent. Sri Yukteswar says the purification of the heart is a very long process, and the purification of the heart is to remove from it all those restlessnesses that make us think that we don't already have within us everything that we need to fulfill us. And I know it as a theory, and I'm sure many of you know it as a theory, and it's a theory I deeply believe. My lack of capacity to adhere to it perfectly is not because I think it's wrong. It's because there's all of these restless things in my heart that time and again I have to push out and find out whether or not this time it's going to be different. But the other reason why we're pushed out into it is a much sweeter one. Because it's not merely that we have to fail, it's that we have to succeed. We have to actually have that beautiful home. And we have to experience the marvelous creativity of making an environment that's just what we want. And I know some people make a creative lifetime out of buying one home and making it beautiful and then going on and making another, so that I can find out just how much happiness will come from having my environment be just what I want. To be raising a child of whom I can be very proud, who is loyal and loving to me. To have an intimate relationship, a personal kind of love, and find out just how much happiness that can give me. Because we learn from being miserably disappointed. But mostly what happens when we're miserably disappointed is we think if I could just tweak it a little bit, then next time I won't be. So sooner or later, we have to experience all the beauty that this world also gives us. And so when we find ourselves longing for that, and devoting ourselves to that. Don't feel that you're contrary to God's will for you. Far from it. He's impelling you, as Sri Yukteswar put it, the heart is impelled to find out and then to see just how much good can come from looking outside myself so that I can finally say, ah, yes, but how much more comes when I surrender it all to God. You know, the issue is not so much whether we have or don't have. The issue is when we don't have the freedom to choose God's will, when we are impelled by physical or emotional imperatives. And when I think about my lives, which I know there's going to be at least a few more in front of me, I've gradually learned to say, it's not that I want to live in a monastery or be martyred at a young age or have comfort or wealth or anything like that. What I want to have is freedom from compulsion. I want to be able to stand in the center of myself and let God bring to me what I need, instead of moving out of that longing of the heart to step constantly outside of center to try to take it for myself. These are very high ambitions, and they take many, many, many incarnations to fulfill. I was talking to a friend recently, and he was talking about just his restlessness for the pure peace of God realization, I guess is what you would call it, which is an admirable desire. Just this aggravation with the world as it is, which is really easy to understand. I remember a number of conversations I had with Swamiji in the later years of his life. And he would reflect on the tremendous temptation just to become irritated all the time. I mean, it wasn't that he was irritated all the time, but he said how easy it would be to become so. Because everything about this material world, when you're seeking the other, just seems so like such an interruption. But he wrote at the end of his life so differently. He said he used to feel that kind of impatience, and he used to long for another world, as he put it. But then he gradually just came to understand, or more clearly his guru graced him to know. He said, wherever we are, God is. When you think about it just philosophically, there is no place that is more or less divine. There is no individual that is less loved by God. We have that in the Festival of Light every week, not just Jesus and Krishna and great saints, but even those who have sinned most greatly are equally loved, and that's us. We certainly have sinned most greatly. If not yesterday, then in some yesterday we no longer remember. But the presence of God is no less wherever we are. Self-realization is ours already. It's merely improving our knowing. And I think that is a more efficient way to go about the spiritual path. Instead of always, as we are, being anxious about what we're doing or not doing, or what we ought to be doing or ought not to be doing. And I mean, that's the world I live in too. We all live in that world. This incredibly active, rajasic effort. And Swami set us the example. He never rested. To the very end, he was pushing out and trying to make things happen. But one can be pushing out and be very ambitious to fulfill one's karma and to serve God because of a restless anxiety within oneself, that requires that we be in motion. Or it can be acted from this center of knowing that God has put me on this earth and I have to stay busy. Swami and I, sometimes we use the phrase, you have to have your petty enthusiasms when you're here. You've got to have something to do. We have to pass the day making this world a little brighter for those around us and those who come later. But it's the inward surrender that matters. Mother Teresa of Calcutta said something so beautiful, which I've always loved. When someone spoke to her about helping the poor and the statistics of how many people she saved and so on like that, she was a very extremely no-nonsense person. I had the opportunity to meet her a few times when we went to India. She was just all business. And somebody spoke to her about, the good work she was doing, and she just had none of it. She said, "I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do." That was it. That was her answer. Her story was she was going on that train somewhere in Darjeeling, and Jesus said to her, "Go serve the poorest of the poor." So she got off the train and did it. But that was all she was ever doing. She was doing what Jesus had asked her to do. Imagine how simple life becomes when you get it down to that. That's what's really being asked of us. Whatever it is in front of you. Swami was once asked, "How do you know what your karma is?" He said, "Well, look around. How do you know what your dharma is?" He said, "Well, if it needs to be done and you're next in line." That's about how much effort he put behind it. He said it in a much more depressing way to me once. He said, "People think it matters so much what they do, but we all have so many," he wasn't speaking of himself, "we all have so many lessons to learn. We can learn them in any number of ways. So it isn't really what you appear to be doing. It's what you're doing. Am I doing what God and Guru asked me to do?" And Jesus really didn't ask us to have this job or live in that house or marry that person or give birth to these children. He really didn't. He said, "Love me. How much have you loved?" One question. How much have you loved? Dr. Ritchie, I don't know his first name. He died, and he had a near-death experience. He met Jesus. Jesus said to him, so simple, "How much have you loved?" And Ritchie had not loved very much. And he worked really hard to justify his lack of loving. Really hard. And Jesus just kept smiling at him and saying, "How much have you loved?" And he got sent back, and he spent the rest of his life loving. And he became a psychiatrist, and he did this, and he wrote books, and he did all of that. But his life was very, very simple. Everything that came in front of him, he loved. Because he knew what was going to happen. And the next time he wanted to be able to give a better answer. I love to think of my life review, and I weigh a lot of decisions on the basis of being after this life, standing in front of the masters and having them look at me, and my being able to say, "Yes, sir. How much did you love?" As much as I could. Swamiji said the only question he's concerned about is when he met Master again, and Master said, "Have you loved me?" Swami did say, "Sir, that's all I've ever loved." God bless you.